Hi there, I'm Lindee G, and today we're going to learn about applique. And applique is just one of my favorite things to do, and I'm going to show you why. I'm going to show you a bunch of samples to start with, and then we'll see how to make applique work on our embroidery machine. So here's my latest project. He is 30 inches tall, he has over 30 appliques, and you will need a large hoop because he is multi-hooped. And he's 3 hoopings. But would you really want to sew that many stitches in that big a design? I mean, you'd be sewing forever. So this really takes advantage of a lot of different stitch types and a lot of different fabric types. So he may not be up on the website yet. I have to finish writing the instructions and then he'll be up. So here's another one of my favorite pieces from a couple years ago. This is machine embroidered applique. So I designed the quilt, I did all the applique, I pieced it, but I had someone long arm it for me, and she's a pro at that. So this is birth month flowers of the year, and looks like I have it hanging upside down, but really doesn't make any difference. But what I like about this is that just by changing the fabric types, changing the borders a little bit, you get a completely different look. So look at this one. A lot of times I will have these hanging side by side at a show. People think they're entirely different quilts because they look so different. Now, one of the things I like about applique is you can embroider on things that you can't otherwise embroider on. This is fishnet. And I can't really put an embroidery design on there, but I can applique on it. Applique is also great on terry cloth because it keeps the nap down. Now, this is an old design. These are no longer available. Here's another example of same design, 2 different ways. So I have my party version and I have my everyday version. And they're the exact same except for different fabrics and different threads. And look how different they look. Now, the reason we see so many scattered little designs is this was done way long time ago when I only had a 4x4 hoop. So on this one, we have a little snowman on a checkered fabric. You can't even sew white thread over a checkered fabric and not have the checkered sew through. So this is polar fleece, and it looks really cute on this little design. Now, this one wasn't intended as an applique at all. This is a quilting design. It's one of Shar Jorgensen's, and I've taken the quilting design and I've used fake fur and just stitched that down and then trimmed it off. So this is not going to ravel, and look how cute that is. And I just added a little vest on him. Now, you will find these on the website. This is the same design. This is a little applique purse. Who's got your reader? And it's a little in the hoop bag. You do need to assemble it on the sewing machine, but look how different these look. This one is just fabric, and this one has extra stitching on it, but they are appliques. Here we have a raw edge applique, and the color comes from crayon. So I colored that with melted crayons. Now here's another old piece. And I took a class with Shar Jorgensen to learn how to quilt. And this was a glorified 9-patch. We have all these corners coming in. And I am such a perfectionist. I ripped out my corners too many times, and it's on the bias, so it got all distorted. So I covered up the really bad ones with an applique snowflake. So appliques are really great. Here's another little fun quilt. These are available on the website. And these fit a 4x4 hoop. So even if you have an older, smaller machine, you can still do applique. And these are just so much cuter applique because that brown area, the cookie area, would just be a lot of blah looking fill stitches. If you have a larger machine, you have some more applique, And these come with a quilted version, a stipple quilted version around the applique, and a plain version. And they're also in 2 sizes. So this is the larger size. Look how cute that is. Now that one involves cutting a lot of different fabrics, but this little baby quilt only involves cutting 2 different fabrics. So the yellow for the duck and the orange for the wheels. This ribbon that you see here, it's not part of the applique. I just laid it down and fused it in place, and then I stitched over it. And this also has quilting in the hoop, and it's echo quilted. So then I just use piece as you go to assemble it. If you live in the Southwest, you'll definitely want some Southwest decor. And here is a Southwest quilt. And this is also quite an old design, but it is available on the website. So if you scroll down, you have to be on the main website. You can't be on YouTube. Go back to the website, scroll down, and you'll see all the specials listed down there. Now, you might see this Halloween design back here. And he has 2 appliques, or she has 2 appliques, one for the shoes and another one for the legs. And you can get so much variety with applique. I just love it. So let's move on and see how to do it with the embroidery machine. Okay, let's see what you need to do to prepare your appliques. What I've done is I've created templates, printed out my templates on just regular printer paper. And then I've taken another sheet of paper and I've cut a piece of Totally Stable. Now this is an iron-on tearaway stabilizer. It's very lightweight. So it works really well for this. This is about the only thing I use Totally Stable for, unless I'm doing decorative stitches with my sewing machine. It's really not sturdy enough for heavy-duty embroidery. So I'll cut a piece of this and I'll fuse it just along the bottom edge and the top edge of my paper, run it through my printer or my copier. I can use this to just copy it, and I'll just print all these templates on there. And then what I do is I separate them and I fuse them to the front of my fabric. So here you see them fused to the front of my fabric, and I've got them laid out on a piece of Steam-A-Seam 2. Now I like this product because it is double stick. So it's pressure sensitive, it sticks easily to the back of my fabric. When I peel it off and put it in the hoop, it sticks there. So I don't have to use a heat iron or heat tool in my machine if I don't need to. And I use this most of the time, but I don't use it if I'm cutting in my cutter. I have not found a way to use this in my cutter because it sticks to my cutter bed. So another product you may be tempted to use is something like this template tearaway. This does not work well for applique templates, and I'll tell you why. It sticks too well to the fabric. You can't peel it off when you're ready to put it in the machine. It leaves gooey, gunky, sticky stuff behind on your fabric, and it sticks so well that when you're pulling it off, it distorts your fabric. So don't use this for appliques. So I have mine all arranged, and now what I need to do is take some scissors, and I happen to like these guys, and I'm going to cut right on that line all the way around. And you want to cut very precisely and very cleanly. So you want to use sharp scissors. Now once you have it cut out, you'll have your fusible on the front. I still have my protective paper sheet on the back, and then if I remove that, there is my Steam-A-Seam 2. So then I just sew my placement line and stick this down. Now the other method that we have for stitching applique, I call it the blob method, but it's more technically known as the trim and place method. So the only difference between these two is that once you place your placement line, if you're using a pre-cut, all you do is you line this up directly in there, and it should exactly match up, because that placement line is the same line we use for creating our pattern pieces. Now if you're using the trim and place method, then you're going to just place your fabric over that, and you'll need to sew that placement line again. And most designs tend to be set up for this trim and place method. I really only use the trim and place method on something that doesn't work well for a pre-cut. And that might be some stretchy, fuzzy fabric that I can't adhere in place. So I can't adhere a template to the front, I can't adhere a fusible web to the back. And so I'll use this method. But for normal cotton weight fabrics and fabrics that can be fused, I don't use this method because it's too hard. And I'll show you why it's too hard. So the only difference between a pre-cut design and a trim and place design, well, at least in the way I make them, is that the trim and place design repeats this line again. Now I can tell you that I think every one of my designs is set up for pre-cut. It's going to have a placement line, a zigzag tack down, and then a satin cover. The satin cover may not exactly follow this. It may go later on. We'll talk about that in another part here. But if you want to use one of those kind of designs for a trim and place one, all you need to do is back up one color change to get to this design. So I'm just going to lay my fabric over that stitched line, over my placement line. Now, I didn't spray it. I don't have any sticky stuff on the back. If you're worried about it slipping, you can tape it. Sometimes I will starch it. But remember, a lot of times I'm doing this with something like polar fleece where those steps don't really work. Now, if you're working with a cotton or something that's wrinkled, make sure it's pressed and smooth. So now I'm just put down the presser foot and start. So now it's essentially repeating the placement line again. And this is going to be my line that I'm going to trim back. Now, did you notice how it actually stopped there, but it moved up here and did a little stitchy thing? That's because I have my frame out right up here. Now, the frame out on an applique design is where the needle moves at the end of each step. And you really want it at the top of your design. And the reason we want it there is so that you have access to all of this area. So if I was doing a pre-cut, I could just lay my pre-cut right in there in that stitching line without having to remove this from the hoop. Now, think about this. If we rotate the design in the hoop, this position does not shift. So if I rotate it so that my heart is like this, that point is going to be down here. And that means that when it goes to the frame out position, everything is going to be behind the needle. So if you do need to rotate, think about what direction to rotate so that you don't get in the way. So now I'm ready to take it out of the machine, and we need to trim right up to that stitching line. And now the fun part begins. Now this is a relatively simple shape, so it's not too horrible with this one. And I'm going to get out some other scissors here. And these are those double curve scissors. Really like these for trimming. And now what you need to do is to trim this back to that stitching line without cutting through the stitching line and without leaving too much fabric behind. So we want to trim right up to that. And the closer you trim, the better. So that's what you're going to do all the way around. Now it's pretty easy on these areas out here. But when you start getting into little pointed areas like that, it gets hard. And now the next step is to put it back in the machine, and I'm going to sew the zigzag tack down, and so that's going to hold it along the edge. I like a zigzag tack down rather than a running stitch tack down because the running stitch tack downs can push the fabric, and with the zigzag tack down, it's actually biting into the fabric. And so it tends not to ravel off the edge of your fabric as much. When you have a really narrow satin cover, or you're just using running stitches on a pre-cut, it can ravel off the edge because it's just worrying the edge of your fabric there. So that's pretty much all there is to a simple applique. Once your applique is done, you will not know whether you used a pre-cut or a trim in place, as long as you trimmed carefully along the edge. And that's what I see most often on Facebook. I see these appliques and there's little pokies sticking out and fabric edges sticking out, or they cut into the fabric, or they didn't place it accurately and then there's a gap in there. So when you have a satin stitch that's, say, 3 millimeters to 3.5 millimeters wide, that's pretty safe for your fabric. When you start getting down to 2 millimeters or thinner, you have to be very, very precise with your fabric placement. Also, you'll need to have some kind of fusible web. when you have a fusible web under there and you activate it after you've stitched, and you'll do that by pressing it from the back, that will make your fabric more permanent and it'll make it look better longer. Now here's another tip. I pre-wash my fabrics ahead of time. I pre-wash my appliques, I pre-wash my base fabric, because you don't want one of them to shrink and the other one not to. So can you work with fabrics that aren't washable? Sure. You just need to pay attention to how you work. Also, this is a quilt weight cotton. We can fuse onto this. I've worked on other items that I can't fuse onto. And so then what I'll do is I'll use something like KK2000. And I like this spray because it's more targeted. It doesn't go all over my sewing room. And you want to just kind of mist the back and put it down. Or you're going to mist the back of your template and put it on the front for cutting. Now, this stuff dissipates rather quickly. You don't want to go too heavy on it. You just want to mist your template pattern quickly, put it on the front, and cut it out quite right away. You need to make sure that your template does not shift when you're cutting. So that's why I like the Totally Stable. Yes, you can use freezer wrap, but I found that freezer wrap just doesn't stick as well. I mean, I can iron and iron and iron and it still peels off while I'm trying to cut. So that's why I like this. And there are probably other iron-on tearaways that you can use. Maybe you could use a pressure-sensitive sticky backing. I just don't care for the pressure-sensitive stickies because some of them just don't peel off as easy. So let's look at a couple other designs. So let's take a look at this little design. I like designs like this because you can make it into a little girl elephant or a little boy elephant, and it just depends on your fabric colors. Now this one is from Lindee Designs, and it's by Artsy Knots. Now, do we know if it's a pre-cut or if it's a trim in place? We don't know by looking at this. It didn't come with any templates, so if it is a pre-cut, you're going to have to figure out how to make your own templates. And I did that, so I made my own templates because look at this design. Do you want to try to cut that out in the hoop? I don't think so. You are not going to be able to cut that out without disturbing your hoop tension. When you trim in place, you have to trim with your hoop flat on something. You can't be putting fingers up underneath it so you can push the fabric up and trim closer. If you do that, you are disturbing your hoop tension and your stitches are not going to align. So this is just a little elephant. I'm adding it to an in the hoop design here. And this is an in the hoop baby bib. When I brought it in here, I changed some of the colors so that I knew what they were. On here, we just see number 1 is orange sorbet. Number 2 is buttercup. We don't know what those do. Now what they do is that first color in this design is the placement line for the body of the elephant. The second one is the cutting line. So this is set up for a trim in place. So what I'm going to have to do is when that placement line sews, I place this and I'm going to fuse it in place. I do have my steam seam on the back and I have my applique iron heating back there. So I'm going to fuse it in place so that it doesn't shift. Because when it sews that line to tack the fabric down, remember when we sewed that heart, we had a piece of fabric and it sewed that running stitch again in the same place. That running stitch is not going to catch this fabric. If it does, I've just placed this off a little bit or I've cut it off a little bit. And the bad thing about that is it'll be so close to the edge, it could ravel off the edge. So what I want to do is fuse this in place at my machine. Now I'm not worried about damaging my machine. It's not going to get that hot because I'm actually stitching on quilted fabric. So it's protected a little bit that way. But if you're worried about something like that, slide a piece of cardboard or something under your hoop and just press that way. Or you can take the hoop out of the machine. I don't like to take the hoop out of the machine unless I need to, because you can put it back in and catch your fabric underneath or not flip the lever down or not do something and it doesn't get lined up. So I try to remove the hoop only when I have to. So I'm actually going to skip a few stitches in here because I'm not going to sew this placement line. This would normally sew right on your stabilizer. You place a piece of fabric down and stitch it in place again. But I'm just going to wait till the end and then I'll stitch this second outline down, which will attach my back. So what I needed to do when I work on a design like this is just one design with 3 colors. The placement, the color line, and the line that attaches the backing. But what I need to do is just put my little elephant in between so that it falls before that outline stitch. So let's go over to the machine and we'll start sewing. So I have my design loaded. I'll go to color number 3. And this is the elephant placement line. Now notice where it stopped. It stopped in the middle of the body. And that makes it a little hard to place our applique fabric without getting in the way of the needle. But I think I can do that. And I'm using Steam-A-Seam 2, which has a double stick tacky on it. I'll take my tacking iron and I'll just press it in place. Now this design does come in several sizes. I'm using the smallest one, which would fit a 4x4 hoop. The next color would be that stitching line that would attach the fabric in place, and it's just another straight stitch. So I'm going to skip it. Now the next color is his toenails. So I'm just going to keep sewing. So at this point, my toenails have sewn, the cheeks have sewn, some little face details sewn, but there has been no zigzag tack down on this. And if I'd sewn that second placement line, that cutting line, it would have just been a straight stitch right around the edge. It would not have caught my fabric properly. So there's nothing really securing my fabric other than the fusible web. And even that was not enough to keep the fabric from pulling. So I'm going to zoom in, see if we can see this. There's quite a gap right in here. So hopefully that won't be a problem when I'm done. I have to figure out another way to do this. I might have to edit the design. So now we're ready to sew the placement line for the ear. Have my fabric ready. Now this doesn't have any detail on it, so hopefully it won't shift very much. And put the presser foot down, press go. Now this one did stop at the top, so that makes it easy. I got the wrong one there. So get the other ear. Just fit that on there like that. Press it into place. Put the presser foot down. And see, it's just sewing a straight stitch around there again. So that would not have cut my applique. The next color that sews is the satin cover. Put the presser foot down and we'll sew. Our little elephant is all stitched. He looks pretty darn cute. And he did cover up nicely here. Might have a little bit of raveling, but if I fuse it really well, when I'm done, it should hold up okay. Now the next step to finish my project is to lay my backing fabric face down, stitch all the way around. Then I'll trim it, take it out of the hoop, and turn it right side out. Okay, so here's my little baby bib after I finished it. Isn't that cute? And it works up really quick. So can you imagine making a little stash of these for gifts? So you can make them in different colors, so you always have one on hand for whatever gender baby you have. Now this is a pretty short sewing design. It's less than 6,000 stitches, so it does work up really fast, even with the added baby bib project on. Now let's look at another design. So here we have another design from Embroidery Designs. This one is by Dakota Collectibles, and it's a pottery applique. And I have a Southwest theme in my house because I live in the Southwest. And so I thought these would look really great on some bath towels. Now this is a pretty big design. It's about 9 by 6 inches, and it's a high stitch count, 21,060 stitches. Now, that's not too bad for a design this big. And what's saving us a lot of stitches is that the background fill was omitted, and instead we'll use fabric. Now on towels, that's especially good because number one, you're not drying yourself with a big wad of stitches and stabilizer on the back. But number two, the fabric applique helps keep the nap down on the towel. Now this is too big for like a hand towel. So what I might do is see if there's another design that's just maybe that part of the design, or maybe I can edit it. And actually I can edit this one because it's in an object format, which is CND. Now it also shows art here, but if I recall correctly, I don't think this is a native art format. I don't think it's a grade A. I think it's just stitches only that's been converted. Now in the color sequence, this gives us a little bit more information than the elephant did. It says we have an outline, we have a tack down, and then the brown is the satin stitching that's going to cover it. We still don't have a template file, so I don't really know just by looking at this if this is a trim in place or I should use a pre-cut. So I looked at the design in the software and I saw where the placement line was and where the next line was, which would be the tack down. And the tack down is a run stitch and it's inside of the outline. So I decided, well, that must mean it's a trim in place. And this has a pretty wide satin stitch on it. So it's going to be very forgiving, and it's going to be much easier to do this as a trim in place. And it's not that hard of a shape. We have a little bit of stuff here, but this is a big design. So it shouldn't be too hard to trim in place. Now before I stitch this on my towels, I do want to test sew. And so I have this older towel that's kind of ratty, and I'm going to test sew on it. And it's just a hand towel, and it was too small to hoop in the proper orientation in my hoop. And also when I tried to hoop this towel the other direction, it just didn't hoop well with this hoop. Now normally what I would like to use for a stabilizer is a wash away tear away, because with an applique we're going to have exposed stabilizer on the back. I like the wash away tear away because it tears out easily and it goes away with the washing, so you don't see a bunch of stabilizer back there. What I used instead was a stick and gone, or wet and gone I guess it's called. And it's a wash away sticky. And that's because I had to float my design. So this towel has seen better days, so I'm not worried about if I mess it up. You might also notice that I have a water-soluble topping on here, and I've basted it in place, and I've already stitched that first placement line. So color number 1 has been sewn already. I sewed it in black just so you could see it. So the next step is for me to place my fabric. And what I'd probably do is to tape it down to this water-soluble. I don't want to tape it to my towel. Well, this towel's not going to hurt. But on a normal towel, you probably don't want to put tape down because it could pull up your nap. Now, why is that on there? It's not to keep the stitches from poking through. It's to keep my towel safe, because when I sew this and I pull this back to trim it, I do not want to be trimming my towel. I only want to be trimming my fabric. So this is just a safety guard for my fabric. Now, the original design, C&D version, was oriented like this. But when I opened up the PES version, it looked like this. And it's been rotated to fit our more vertically oriented hoops. Now when I looked at the design, the frame out, which is where the hoop goes in between the applique steps, was here. And of course when our design was oriented properly, that would have been fine because it would have been easy to access our design when it's oriented there. But when it's rotated this way, that means this whole big area is behind the needle. So what I did is when I got it to my machine, I rotated it 180 degrees this way. The other advantage that gives me on this machine is that the arm of the machine is over here. If I'm working on a big towel, I do not want to have it bunched up in my machine over here where it could throw itself under the hoop and get stitched in place. So this serves two purposes. It gets my frame out up here where I can access this area easily, and it moves the rest of my towel off the side of my machine where it's not going to interfere with anything. All right, so here's one last design I got from embroiderydesigns.com. And as we look at it, we can see that it's this cute little mixer design. I thought it would look really cool on kitchen towels. It's not very big. It's from Hopscotch. It's got 12,556 stitches in it. And that's because this bowl is filled all the way in. It's only about 4 1/4 by a little over 4 1/2 inches, and it'll fit a 5x7 hoop really easily. Comes in a wide range of formats. Now it does come in art, C&D, and EMB. These might be objects, they might not be. And when I looked at it in software, art was not a grade A design, which means that it didn't have all objects. The EMB version was a grade A. The grades have nothing to do without stitches. It's the type of stitches that compose the design. And a grade A means it's composed of objects. So when I looked at it in software, I looked at the EMB version, and I noticed a couple things. Now, first of all, I wanted to sew on some towels. Now, this is an old one. You can see it's kind of dirty up here, and I was just going to test on it. But this is sort of a waffly kind of texture. So it has a high-low terry cloth. And when you put an applique on this, it's going to be sitting on top of the textured part, but not stuck down to the flat part. So that's a concern when you're picking a design, because you'll probably want to go with something that has a little bit wider satin stitch. When I looked at this design, it only has a 2 mm wide satin cover. And the placement line is only a 1/2 millimeter in from that outside satin stitch. That is a little too close for comfort for me, because you all know that when you stitch, satin stitches pull in. And if they pull in enough, you are going to have fabric exposed. So you're going to need to cut your applique very precisely and place it very precisely if you're going to use this design. Now, I'm not going to use it on this fabric because I don't think it's going to cover well on this. I could change to a different fabric, or if I'm still concerned about that, I could just skip the applique. And if I skip the applique, I would also skip these fill stitches in here. It's real easy to do that because it's own color change, I think. I would probably take it out in software so that I didn't forget to do it in the machine. Now, could you enlarge the design so you had wider stitches? Yes, but you need to look at the design to see if that's okay. This little heart is satin stitches that run up and down. And those stitches are almost 10 millimeters long at the longest. So you can't enlarge this very much, or you may have a heart that has missing stitches where the stitches just got too long. So this is really why you need to look at the design in software to see if it's going to work for how you want to use it. This is a usable design. It's not going to work for the way I want to use it. So I'm going to skip this design. I've opened up my software, and this is Hatch Digitizer. You don't necessarily need to have Digitizer software to do what we're mostly going to do in here. So what I want to do is poke around in designs and show you what you should look for before you sew a design. So this is the simple basic heart shape that we saw stitched. And it was digitized in Hatch. It's just a simple shape, and it's an applique object. In most software programs, objects have special properties. And this one is sort of an applique all rolled into one. We see one color here, but if I go to the Colors tab, we see 3 colors. And that's because it's kind of bundled in all these steps. This one's set up for a pre-cut, so there we see our placement line. Here is our tack down. In this case, it's a box zigzag. And then we have a cover stitch. And in this case, it's a satin. Now, although we have 3 colors here, we can sew all of these in the same color. We don't have to stop and change for every color. So if you have a design that has multiple appliques, you can freak out over the number of color changes in there, but it's really just these extra steps to get the machine to stop. So I'm going to turn off Tree View, and we can see these little triangles here. In fact, I'll zoom in. Press B on the keyboard, I'll zoom right in right there. And I'm going to also press S, and that just turns off these stitches. And you see some extra dots and stuff here. what's going on is this is my frame out position. And the frame out is where the needle moves in between these steps. So these little triangles indicate there's a trim. That's because we have 3 colors here. So it starts and ends right there for this, starts and ends right there for the tack down, and starts and ends right there for the satin. And what that means is if the needle stops there, it means all of this part of the design is in front of the needle. And so that's a good thing because it means that we can place our applique without taking our hoop out of the machine. So this is something you want to look for. Where is it going to stop when you sew it? So you did see this little elephant sew. He's really cute. We see that we have a placement line. We have a tack down line. I'm going to turn off True View and I'm just going to select these 2 objects and I'm going to hide everything else. See right there, that's where he starts and ends. So that means that if we are using a pre-cut or even if we're using what I call the blob method, which is the trim in place method, we have to somehow smooth our fabric back behind the needle. And it can be hard to see, especially on a multi-needle machine. It's not so hard on a single needle, but on those multi-needle machines, it's really hard to see behind those needles. Can I move that? Not really, because this is a stitches only file. Now notice that we only see one, looks like one object here. That's because our placement line and our tack down line are stacked right on top of each other. And as you saw when I sewed this, I used a template. I managed to cut a template from this, and I will show you how to do that. But when I do that, I have nothing that can tack my applique cutout in place because these lines are going to be right on the outline. And what happens next, I'll unhide these, unhide selected. So it's going to sew all these things. And in the meantime, that's kind of pulling on my fabric and it's not held in place. And I did try to fuse it, but evidently I didn't fuse it well enough because it pulled right there. So how would you fix that? Well, if you have a digitizer, you just digitize in another object. I didn't do that. I just let it sew the way it did. But these are things you need to know ahead of time so that you can plan for them. Now, would it have been better to do a trim in place? I don't think so, because look at these tiny little areas here. How would you get up in there and trim that out? It would be really, really hard. This little square here is a 4-inch hoop. So that represents my 100 millimeter hoop. This design has multiple appliques. We can see that they are the placement lines for the body. Here's the placement and tack down for one ear, and here's the other ear. So I'll unhide those. Unhide selected. So this has multiple appliques, and they're all placed separately. Now I often do that, even though technically these could have all been placed at the same time, but in most cases you don't want to do that. And the reason is the more appliques you place at one time before they all get stitched into place, the more your design can shift. I prefer to take my time at the machine. I'd rather spend a few extra minutes or seconds changing a thread or adding another applique than sewing a big design and having to throw it out because it didn't turn out good. So I like that this is a multi-step applique. I just wish it had tack down stitches that were zigzags. Here's where I've added it onto my baby bib. And this is just this really simple shape. It's an in the hoop applique baby bib. And normally what you would do, you would use this as a placement guide on your stabilizer. Then you'd place your big blob of fabric down. And then you'd use the second line, this one, to tack it in place. Then I've added in my little elephant. So all my little elephant sews. And then the last step that sews is the seam line. So that's where I place my fabric on the front, face down, stitch that, and then I'm going to turn it through this opening. So this baby bib is just a personal design I have. It's one of those things where I thought I was going to do something with it, but that's all the farther I got. So it's just sort of a template thing that I can use. It does require 6x10 hoop. So here are those Pueblo pots that I was talking about. And I really like this design. This is from Dakota. This is the CND file. And see these stitches that are zigzagging out here? It's because this right here is that frame out line. So it jumps out to there in between the applique stops. We have objects, so we could change them. Now, because this has already been included as a PES file, I'll use that. This is all stitches. This little ziggy-zaggy line means that this is a stitches only thing. It's not an object. Notice that it's been rotated sideways. Remember when it was rotated horizontally, that frame out was in this corner. If we rotate the design in this direction, the frame out is now down here. And of course, when the frame out is down at the bottom, that means all of this area is going to be behind the needle. So instead of rotating it this way, and the software just did that when it was exported, I would rotate it the other direction. So I can either do that in software, or I can do that at the machine. I'll do that here just so you can see it, know what we're talking about. And I didn't get the 100 in there. So there it is, flip the other direction. And now the frame out is up here. So that makes it much easier to use at the machine. So let's look at the placement line on this one. I'm going to go back to the CND file for this. Here is the placement line. And you can see this magenta line. I'll zoom in just so make it easier to see. And that is my placement line. If I come down here, this is my tack down. So this to me looks like it was designed for a trim in place because we have this margin of space in here. So if I place my fabric according to that outline, and then I stitch it down according to this line, and I trim to that line, that means that we have all this nice area out here that it will get covered up. But because it's stitched onto my fabric, it's going to be okay on this inside edge. So if I try to use this as a pre-cut line, some places it gets really close to the edge. And I just think that this is a safer option to do this as a trim in place. Now we have one other design we looked at, and that's this mixer design. This is a really cute design. I thought this would be really fun to stitch on towels, but when I looked at it in the software, I wasn't sure that I wanted to sew it. It looks over here like we have a placement line and a tack down line, but that turns out not to be the case. If we go over here, both of those are the same color. So it does a placement line and it goes around twice. If I select it and press H, which is reshape, we can see that the start and entry point are right there. This is not set up as an applique object. It may have been broken apart at some point, but I don't see a frame out. So the machine is going to stop right there. And then we have to lay our fabric down behind the needle again. I'm going to zoom in just so we can see some things up here. And you can see how close that is to the edge. Now there is a tack down stitch. It's this one. And it looks like it's right there, but it's an offset. Well, I'm going to select these. And I'm going to hide the others. And I'm going to turn off Tree View. So here is my placement stitch. And it goes around and sews twice. And here is the tack down. And you can see that it's just coming in from that outside edge, which is really nice. Because if we cut our fabric to this line, then that means our tack down is going over our fabric edge and holding it in place. Now I'm going to measure those. I'm going to press M on the keyboard. And I'm just going to measure that. And look, it's not even 1 millimeter. So we have a satin column that's only about, or a zigzag column that's only 1 millimeter wide. That's pretty thin. I'm going to turn on this, which is my satin cover, unhide selected, and I'm going to measure that. So I'll press M on the keyboard, and I want to measure from one side over here to the other. And it's just barely 2 millimeters. So that's a pretty skinny column. If I turn off True View and I measure from that placement line out to the edge, it's, you know, about 1/2 millimeter. When we sew the satin stitch, it's going to pull in, and let's say that it pulls in half that distance. Will we be able to place our fabric accurately enough or trim it in place accurately enough so that it's not exposed? I don't know. That's kind of iffy for me. So no, advantage I have here is that this is an object-based file. So I could change these stitch properties so it suits the way I like to do applique, which is a little bit more comfort zone on that placement and tack down and cover stitch. Now, what if you don't have an object file? Or what if you have a program that can't read an object file, or at least this object file? What can you do then? One thing you could do is you could enlarge the design. Let's see if we can do that with this design. If we look at this heart, it has some pretty long stitches on it. So I'm going to press B on the keyboard. I'll zoom in. I'll press M to activate the measure tool. I'm just going to measure from one side down here to the other. And that's 9.72 millimeters. Press escape. Let's measure here. 9.17 millimeters. So that's pretty long. Some machines cannot stitch that long. And if you've ever enlarged letters, if you're on Facebook, you've probably seen this in some of the groups where someone's done some really wide satin stitch letters, and then at just certain points in the letter where the column got thicker, there were just no stitches there. It just didn't stitch anything. What happened was the stitch length in the design exceeded the stitch length of your machine, and the machine just couldn't stitch it. So can we enlarge this design? Maybe, maybe not. We definitely don't want to go any bigger than 12 millimeters because about 12.2 something is a jump stitch in most machines. And then it wouldn't stitch at all. Now, because I have Hatch and because this is an EMB design, I could fix that. And what I would do is I would just go over here to the Fill tab and I'd change the auto split and I just turn it on. Put some texture in there because what it does is it makes sure the stitches don't exceed a certain length, which is around 7 millimeters. When stitches get too long, they're too likely to snag and catch on things. They're just not very stable. So now we come to the question, if I change this design so that it suits the way I like to do applique, is it now my design or is it still their design? It's still their design. Assuming that I have the rights to stitch it and sell the sewn version, I'm okay. But I cannot give away or sell the design, even though I might have made significant changes to it. It's still their design. So let's look at one more design. This is a design I just finished. It is a multi-hoop design. Here you can see it with the 3 overlapping hoopings. I'm going to turn off the hoop for now. And these are appliques. This has over 30 appliques in it. This is the whole combined version. So when you look at the color sequence list, and we'll do that by going to Print Preview, here you can see it says it has 130 colors. Really, it has 23 colors. Now it's counting the placement line and the tack down each as a color. So really it only has 21 colors. And remember, they're not all in the same hoop. I do have some extra colors in here, like I have gold in here twice because sometimes I want metallic gold on places and other times I want regular gold. But don't freak out when you see a multi-applique design because each one of those appliques is going to have 3, possibly 4 color stops. And really, you're going to be sewing them all in the same color. So number 9 here is after I've sewn a couple placements here. So all the colors from 1 up to 9 can be the same gold color. Now, how would you know that? Well, you snoop around in the design to see where it changes. So I'll close that. So for example, if we go back to the baby applique, all these colors look pretty similar down here. So on this design, if I was happy with the toenails being the same color as the placement line, say they're not going to be significantly different, I could sew colors 1 through 6 all in the same color because only these toenails are visible. These are just placement guides and stitching, cutting lines. These 3 can be pink. Actually, these 6 can all be pink. So colors 12 through 17 can all be sewn in the same color that you use for the cover here. So you don't really have as many colors as you might think. You're just having these color stops. Now, when you saw me sew this, you saw that I used pre-cuts. This design did not come with any templates. So how did I get those? Well, what I did was I took this one, hold down the Control key, and copy these placement guides. I copied, created a new document, pasted, and then I just kind of moved these out a bit so there's some space between them. Oops. And these are stitches only. See, they're just stitches. On a normal hatch created design, let's go back to this one. I can go to Export Cutting, and it sees I have an applique shape. And it gets that from this applique object. Now, if this is not an applique object, I'll break it apart by pressing Control K a couple times. So that's not an applique object anymore. Make sure that's not an applique object. Now when I go to Export Cutting, it asks me, do I want to export the embroidery shapes? Because these are not applique shapes. These are not applique objects. What I really want to do is just export that one. So I select it, Export Cutting, and then there I can get just that file. And that's the exact size and shape I need. Now on the baby elephant there, we've copied those objects over here. Well, they're not objects, but they're just stitches. And if I select all, and I go to Export Cutting, these are grayed out because these are not objects. It has to be a closed object. What I mean by closed object, if you can think of the difference between a rubber band and a piece of string. A rubber band is a closed object because it's a continuous outline or continuous shape, and you don't really have a start or end. A piece of string has a beginning and an end. Even if you tie it into a knot, you still have two end pieces, right? So it has a beginning and an end. Those are objects. These are not objects. But on some designs, I can go to Create Layouts. You will need Digitizer for this step. Create Offsets, Outlines and Offsets. Click Object Outlines. I'm going to pick a dark color. Click OK. And now these are actual hatch objects. Now when I go to Output Design, I can export cutting. And I have applique shapes, and I'll export the current design or export selected designs. And that will create an SVG file. It doesn't always work. So if it doesn't, what you do is you can still copy and paste those shapes into another file. And this time we'll go to Capture Design Image. And what this does is it will create a file that has PNG outlines. They'll look like stitches, but they'll be outlines that you can use for your templates. It's going to be a bitmap. I don't know if you can convert that to an SVG that a cutter will read. Kind of depends on your cutter. But you could still use it as a hand-cut template. Other software has these capabilities too. You just need to look in your manual and see how to do it in your software. So even if it won't export a cut line like an SVG, you can probably do this as long as they're separated by color changes, and they are, because it has to have a separate color to do that placement line. So poking around in software, in designs, can help you learn new tricks. Once you get to a certain level, you can start looking at designs and decide whether it's what you want to work with. For example, if I have a nicely firmly woven fabric, I'll probably be fine with this. But if I have a fabric that is not very stable, that could easily ravel, I would not want to use it with this design. With this design, I would want to think about using a fabric that would require trim in place. Fluffy fabrics like polar fleece, I almost always use trim in place for that. Now for fabrics like polar fleece or fluffy furry fabrics, you can't fuse something to those because they'll melt. So a lot of times I will use a trim in place with those, especially if they're bulky, because even if you do cut it to shape, that extra thickness can cause a problem with the tack down, and the tack down doesn't catch it. So I might want to use a trim in place on this. Now it'd be really hard on this small guy, but remember he comes in 3 sizes. So a larger one could be more easy to work with. So having software is so useful. You'll learn a lot about your designs. You can prevent a lot of mistakes, And depending on your software and the format you get, you might be able to adjust the design in a way that makes it better suited for your purpose. So let's do a quick review. Here's our little heart. And I've sewn the same heart, and all I've done is use different color cover stitch. Here I've matched my heart fabric. Here I've matched my background fabric. And here I have a high contrast. It's the exact same design. Here the heart looks smaller. Here the heart looks larger. And here it's just really bold. It looks like a coloring book kind of because of this bold black outline. One of the things I love about Applique, it sews on so many different types of fabrics. It's the closest thing we have to a universal design. And you have so much variety with it. So even with the same fabric, look at this one. I've laid down a piece of lace with a piece of ribbon through it when I stitched this one. Here I crinkled my fabric. Here it is with the blanket stitch version. So here's a reverse applique. And instead of putting the fabric on the top, I put it on the back. I did all the same steps, and this time I cut out the inside and I kind of snipped in here like fringe, and then I ran it through the washer and dryer so we have this nice kind of rough looking design. You also see a lot of raw edge applique. And here I've used the same heart, but I've just done some kind of free motion stitching around the edge, and it's the fusible web that is going to secure this piece of fabric to the background. So there's so many ways to use applique. Start with a simple design, work out your technique. I find that I get a much better result using the pre-cuts than trying to do the trim in place. When you trim in place, you're taking more time at your machine. There's more of a chance that you can disrupt your machine tension, because if you push up on your fabric so you can trim next to the edge, you are distorting it in the hoop and nothing will go right after that. So I hope you've enjoyed this class. If you're on YouTube, you need to go back to the main web page to take advantage of the specials, and you just need to scroll down below this video.